And my name's Megan Irlmeier, and I'm going to be talking to you today about my experience with COVID vaccine clinics that I put on. Could I get a show of hands how many of you have been able to, over the past year, vaccinate patients or help with COVID clinics? Okay, great. And then if you want to keep your hands up if you're from out of state, too. I was also wondering. Good. Okay, so I'm hoping that all of you that raised your hands will be able to help chime in with a bit of your experience with the clinics that you helped out with. So let's go ahead and get started with a little bit of a timeline. On March 11th of 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. And then in August, the American Society for Clinical Pathology was asked to help with Operation Warp Speed in developing and administering the vaccine. And Operation Warp Speed prioritized healthcare workers and residents of skilled nursing facilities, assisted livings, nursing homes, and they were supposed to be in the first group to be vaccinated. The original plan was to have large chain pharmacies such as Walgreens or CVS take care of phase 1, but they kind of found out that that wasn't going to be the best way to go. So when a facility put in their request, they could request either CVS or Walgreens to supply their vaccines and administer them, or a preferred pharmacy. So the pharmacy that I work at, GeriMed Pharmacy, we're a long-term care pharmacy, and we're unique because we're located in a nursing home. And so GeriMed Pharmacy, our nursing home, and our assisted living are all under the same organization. So when our facility put in our request for vaccine, we selected GeriMed Pharmacy to be the preferred pharmacy, not thinking that we'd ever get a shipment, and Walgreens as our secondary. So after we submitted our request, we started getting emails from Walgreens, which implied to us that they'd be vaccinating our resident and staff. And then the emails stopped. So we made a few phone calls to the government and to Walgreens to see what was going on, and we really didn't get any straightforward answers. Then we started getting shipments of vaccine supplies, and then one morning we got a surprise shipment of Moderna vaccine. And so, deep breath right there, not something that we were expecting to get by any means. So we notified our CEO and set up a meeting the next day with management staff, and during that meeting, we decided where our clinics would be held and on what days we wanted to try and get the bulk of our residents and staff vaccinated in 3 clinics. So clinic day 1 would be your first dose of Moderna. Clinic day 2, 4 weeks later, would be your second dose of Moderna and more first doses. And then clinic day 3 would wrap up with the second doses from the second clinic. We also reviewed our consent forms and our screening forms. We discussed what staff was available to help, and we created a sign-up for appointments the day of the clinic, and then we also started a call list. If you can remember, when the vaccines were first distributed, it was really frowned upon to waste any doses. So we decided to create a call list of family members or friends that would be available to come to the clinic within an hour if we had any doses left over. We also discussed how we were going to vaccinate our staff in waves, because it was recommended to not have them all go to the first clinic in case they would experience adverse effects, and then we'd run into staffing issues. So a few days later, we held our first clinic, and this is just a sample of our setup. The pharmacy is located right next to where we held our clinic, and so we pre-drew all of our vaccine, and some of your objectives were to be familiar with vaccine storage, dose prep, and stability. So I started to make a table with all this information, and I found myself even going and double checking the recommendations. So I decided that take-home tip number 1 for today is to look up the information. We'll run through it real quick just so that you guys can hear it. So Pfizer is the vaccine that is diluted, and the dose for Pfizer is 0.3 mLs, and then Moderna and Janssen or Johnson & Johnson are both 0.5 mLs. Pfizer is stored in an ultra-low temperature freezer. Moderna is stored in the freezer, and Johnson & Johnson is stored in the fridge. And then as far as stability goes, the time of hours and days wavers with each vaccine, and when it goes from freezer to fridge, fridge to room temperature, and also whether or not the vial is punctured. And so that area, the stability, is where it gets really messy, and that's where I just really want you guys to know that it's okay to look that kind of information up, and it's a good idea. So going back over here to how our clinic was set up, our patients or staff members started at the green table, which was the check-in table, and there they'd fill out their consents, and that was just consenting to receive the vaccine. The way we had our form set up is that our consent form was signed one time, even though with Moderna that we were administering, they got 2 vaccines. So those of you that raised your hands, does anyone want to chime in with what you did? Because I know we only had our patients sign 1 consent form, but I know that others had a consent form signed at both visits for their doses. Does anyone? I'm sorry, what was that? So each visit, and so you had 2 different consent forms, or is it one consent
form? They just had to sign it twice.
They signed it twice? Okay. Okay. That's good to know. And then our screening form is also something that the patient would fill out at the check-in table. And I'm just going to run through a few of the things that were on our screening forms. We had the patient's name and date of birth, the yes/no questions, and some of them were if they'd been vaccinated in the past 14 days. And that question was just because the CDC recommended that no one be vaccinated within 14 days of receiving your COVID vaccine, and that's because the adverse effects, they would know then that they are more likely from the COVID vaccine as opposed to another vaccine. If they've ever had any severe reaction to a vaccine, and that would help determine whether the patient was monitored for 15 or 30 minutes after they were vaccinated. And then some of the other common questions, pregnant, breastfeeding, if they're immunocompromised, if they have a blood clotting disorder, and then we also had on there whether or not they had received passive antibodies therapy in the last 90 days. And then our screening form is also where the information that the person administering the vaccine filled out. So they signed it, and they noted whether they vaccinated the right or the left arm, and lot number and expiration date. So the clinics that I've done, the people helping me, technicians and interns, that is a piece that's often missed when I go back through or follow up. So that's just one thing when you guys are able to vaccinate, to make sure that you take the time to fill in that information because it is needed. So after the consent and screening form, the patient or staff member would go and be vaccinated. We had 2 stations and 2 vaccinators vaccinating at most of our clinics. And then they'd go over to the table labeled Human Resources. We just had our HR employees help, and they got their vaccine card, which I think everyone's familiar with. That just tells you what vaccine you got, when, and where. And then the VSafe form, which is the reporting system for adverse effects. And then they'd go sit to be observed with our nursing staff. So as you can see here, we had a couple pharmacy personnel at the check-in table, 2 or 3 human resource people, we had 2 vaccinators, and then we had 2 or 3 nurses observing our patients. So can anyone give me your experience with scheduling second doses? Because for me, that was a hurdle. We had to pull pharmacy staff and nursing staff from our daily duties to run our clinics, so we didn't know when those clinics were going to be until about a week before we scheduled them. So that was kind of a hurdle for me. How did those of you that helped with the clinics handle scheduling second doses?
We're part of the federal program, and so there was a scheduling device within the federal program, and so we would just put it on our schedule.
Okay, so were your patients able to schedule their second?
We did it for them.
Okay, so at the time of their first appointment? Okay. Okay, I think that's how a lot of places did it. After they got their first vaccine, they'd sign up for their second one. Another thing that we kind of ran into with our vaccine sites were being able to maintain the 6 feet social distancing when our patients were being observed, especially when they would come like with a buddy. They'd want to sit right next to each other and hang out and chat. So we had to kind of remind them a couple times to make sure that they spaced themselves out. So some of you might think that once the clinics are done, that's a wrap and everything's done for, but that's not the case. So we're a smaller pharmacy, and we had to work on all of the billing on our own, changing matrix and whatnot. And that's beyond my knowledge, to be honest. But I just know that's a frustrating piece, was and still is for our clinics. Other clinics that you guys might have been a part of or been aware of, some were put on by the county, and they're just funded differently and not billing for the administration fee. Or some of the bigger pharmacies have people that do the billing on the back end. So we're also required by the government. Our COVID vaccine came from the federal government, so we're required to report all vaccinations to the NESIS, which is Nebraska State Immunization Info System. And so when we get a shipment of vaccine in, we'd log it in, and then they'd track our inventory. So within 24 hours after a clinic, we are supposed to report all vaccines and any wasted doses. All pharmacies are responsible for reporting adverse events or errors and adverse effects. So the VARS, or the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, is where you can report things like improper storage. So that's just another, to prevent an error like improper storage is where you'd want to look up that information like I talked about earlier for storage needs and stability. Prepping a vaccine, again, another thing that can be looked up, whether or not a vaccine needs to be diluted or not, and what diluent you use with it. Vaccinating too young is another error that was reported and gets reported to the VARs. So my takeaway message number 2 is that the best way to lower the percent of errors is to have properly trained staff. So whenever I was vaccinating and running a clinic, the screening form was what I made sure everyone helping me was familiar with. And I made sure that they double-checked dates of birth, because there were reports of underaged people being vaccinated. And then I also made sure that they pointed out to me if anyone answered yes, and that would help avoid the 90-day with the monoclonal antibodies. And then also with the severe reaction, I'd have the patient be monitored for 30 minutes or 15. So I'd always just make sure that my staff was trained, especially with the screening form. So the vSafe is another reporting system that all of you, I think, are probably mostly familiar with, and it was important for you yourselves, if you're vaccinated, to report to the system with any adverse effects, or if any patients called or came into the pharmacy and voiced concerns with anything they're experiencing. So it takes a lot of time and reporting to learn about the very rare long-term side effects, and that's why it's important for you to help report adverse events or to help point your patients in the right direction. So there's a lot of discussion on vaccine hesitancy. Like the unknown is one concern. And those with vaccine hesitancy are unsure of adverse events. They had a poor experience with the first vaccine, so they aren't coming back to get their second. Some think they're immune to COVID or that COVID's a hoax. Some people just want to wait and see what the trend is. And some people with the vaccine hesitancy just aren't seeing changes with mandates. For instance, maybe hospitals aren't opening up to visitors as quick as they think they should with the rate of people vaccinated going up, or they don't see any changes with masks as quick as they want to. So when addressing vaccine hesitancy, you want to share the facts and show empathy. So I learned a lot in pharmacy school, but one of the things that I've really taken to heart is to respect others' decisions. One of your code of ethics as a pharmacy technician is to respect and support the patient's individuality, dignity, and confidentiality. So your third and final takeaway tip for today is to respect and understand your patient's decisions. So please just keep that line of your code of ethics in mind when you're serving your patients.